So I recently attended the March for Life in my hometown, where I was also simultaneously responsible for capturing video footage of the event. And a lot of the footage that I captured was of counter-protesters, pro-choice counter-protesters. And so I got exposed to a lot of their rhetorical techniques. And while you'd think that insulting other people for their age or their gender, or blowing noisemakers while the other side is trying to articulate their case, or shouting obscenities at small children,
Have you had sex? No. Yeah. What is it different?
would be tactics that would win any debate, it somehow didn't seem to have the desired effect, because I didn't see a lot of pro-life people getting discouraged or abandoning their position. And I know I'm taking pot shots there. The fact is, I genuinely want to help pro-choice people accurately understand the pro-life position, even if that means that you'll be better equipped to argue against it. So there seems to be this misconception out there that the only reason a person would adopt a pro-life position is because of religious indoctrination or patriarchal misogyny. And that if that's the case, then there's no point in having a logical debate with such people. And while that may be true in some cases, in most cases that I'm familiar with, pro-life people believe what they do because of a logical formula. And this also happens to be what informs my own beliefs on this issue. And that provides an opportunity for people of a pro-choice persuasion, because it means that you can engage that logic with arguments of your own. And if you can disrupt it, then you might win people over to your side, or at least reduce their motivations to be out there pushing their own position. And it gets better because the logic is also very easy to follow, which means it's also very easy to engage with, especially if there are flaws in the logic. So why don't we just start by outlining what that logic is? Now, there are some variable versions of this, but I think I've got it down to its essential premises that lead to a conclusion. And for pro-choice counter-arguments to be effective, all you should have to do is demonstrate how any of those premises are flawed, or how the conclusion doesn't follow from them. So premise one is that murder or homicide is wrong. And I think that's fairly straightforward and something that most of us can agree on. So great, we've already started on some common ground and something that we can work from, and I think that's promising. Premise two is just the definition of murder or homicide, which is important because otherwise we don't understand what premise one means. So the definition is the deliberate killing of an innocent human life. And again, I think that's something most of us can agree on, and most legal jurisdictions seem to go along with that as well. Deliberate and innocent are keywords that should be kept front of mind, because accidentally killing somebody, while bad, isn't the same thing as homicide. And innocent because killing somebody who is a threat to you or to other people isn't necessarily homicide, because it could be described as self-defense. That's also why it isn't necessarily hypocritical for a person to be anti-abortion, but also pro-capital punishment. A person convicted of a serious crime isn't innocent, and therefore killing them doesn't fit the definition that we used earlier with respect to murder and homicide. But that's a different topic altogether, and I'm not necessarily taking a stance one way or the other on that. I'm just pointing out that it isn't necessarily hypocritical. Okay, now the next sequence is where all the contention is, so I'm just going to lay it out there, and then I'll add some commentary after the fact. So premise three is abortion always involves the direct killing of an innocent human life. Therefore, conclusion, abortion is always wrong because it always constitutes homicide. Okay, so let me summarize that again, because I know I was doing a lot of editorializing there and the logic might get confused and lost. So here's the logic. Premise one is murder or homicide is wrong. Premise two is the definition of murder or homicide, which is the deliberate killing of an innocent human life. Premise three is that abortion always involves the deliberate killing of an innocent human life. And then conclusion, therefore abortion is wrong. So premise three is the point at which most people will depart ways. And that's important because that means that that's where you're going to have to focus your attention to try and argue against this logic. Because this logic really is what informs pro-life people and why they believe what they do, even though it's such a socially unacceptable opinion. And that's worth noting because it underscores the sincerity of their beliefs. People who protest against or who oppose abortion aren't advocating for themselves, and they have nothing to gain from it. Unlike other protest movements, like say the civil rights movement or striking workers, people who are protesting abortion are unanimously advocating for somebody else's rights, which proves the sincerity of it and proves that their convictions are logical and moral in nature. So you can't accuse them of trying to leverage some advantage for themselves. And that's why it's so important to focus on their logical and moral convictions. And so with that said, let me spend a little bit of time discussing some of the strategic approaches that I've seen pro-choice people use that do not work. The first instinct of the pro-choice position is obviously to focus on the choice angle. But this isn't convincing from a pro-life perspective because it doesn't address the morality of the choice, which can only be ascertained by convincingly establishing whether or not the life in the womb is a human person or not. Like, we can probably all agree that slavery is wrong, right? But imagine if trying to articulate that case, someone replied to you by arguing that, well, what about my freedom to choose to own slaves? Well, if you think owning slaves is wrong, then that's not going to be very convincing to you. So merely advocating for choice does not undermine the logic of the pro-life position, because we can all agree that some choices should be legal and that some choices should be illegal because they are so seriously immoral. And if the life in the womb is an innocent human life, then arguing that you can choose to kill it is not a good counter-argument. Another lane that pro-choice apologists often get stuck in is with the various reasons that they can come up with to dispute the fact that the unborn is an innocent human life. They'll often resort to trite remarks like, well, it's just a clump of cells. Well, the first problem is that that's just really vague. It's either woefully inadequate as a way of describing the unborn, or it's just factually wrong. Because by the time you're able to detect a pregnancy using a pregnancy test, you're already in weeks 5 and 6 of fetal development, which means that this so-called clump of cells already has unique DNA in a developing nervous system, and by week 6, you can detect a heartbeat. That kind of rhetoric may have been convincing back in the 70s when abortion was first legalized, and they didn't have the technology to show them what is actually inside a woman's womb. But today, we can't rely on those same kinds of blind assertions because we actually do know so much more about fetal development. Another common approach is with an appeal to viability. Some will say that it isn't a human life until it's viable. And I don't think pro-life people find this very convincing for the simple fact that newborn babies aren't viable either. You can't base your criterion for human rights on viability without endangering the lives of infants and everybody who's on life support right now and costing our healthcare system all kinds of resources. Pro-life people will not find logic that throws other classes of vulnerable people under the bus very convincing. Now, I could keep going through the lineup of pro-choice arguments like this, but the point I'm making is that unless you can convincingly demonstrate that the life inside a woman's womb, is not an innocent human life, then there's no situation that you can come up with to justify killing it without committing an act that is the moral equivalent of homicide or murder. So if you want to argue against the premise that the unborn are innocent human lives, then you should probably understand why pro-life people make that conclusion. Pro-lifers believe that human life begins at conception, and the nuances of what is meant by conception may vary, but the general idea is that when an egg and a sperm fuse together, a new life is produced. And that new organism fits all the standard philosophical and scientific criteria that defines what a human life is. And if you want to go into more detail about that, I will link a couple articles that explain that from a scientific perspective in the description for the YouTube video. Pro-lifers pick the point of conception because it's the only one that isn't arbitrary. It reflects scientific and biological reality, which is objective. Any other point of development is susceptible to skepticism and inconsistency, like brain activity or a heartbeat or viability or sentience or whatever. They all just raise more questions like, well, how much brain activity or viability? And what about people who are on life support and are therefore not conscious and not viable? These are the kinds of problems you run into when you choose arbitrary criteria. If they can arbitrarily be instantiated, they can just as arbitrarily be revoked. And human history shows that we have a talent for doing that to other human beings. So pro-lifers just don't take the chance. Even if they're not fully convinced that it is a human life, they aren't willing to gamble on it, considering making a wrong guess could mean murdering someone. Like, imagine if you were at some sadistic carnival where they had a game that meant that you had to choose one of two doors, and if you choose the wrong door, a person gets killed. Any reasonable person would just say, I'm not playing that game. So it's kind of staggering to me to think that there are people out there hysterically screaming and protesting for their right to make that choice when they don't know whether or not there's a person behind that door. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure we can help them out.